Hey everybody, this is Steve Kazanewski. Hope you're all doing well tonight. I am recording this without any interaction, so that should be pretty strange talking to myself, but I guess as a writer, all I really do is talk to myself. So I am in the middle of a really big, really major project that I am editing. And I also owe a blog post for my group blog across the board. So I thought it might be interesting so that I don't lose too much time on the editing project to go ahead and show you guys part of my editing process. I'm just going to start from where I was, and I don't really have anything planned for this episode, any length or anything like that. So I may get frustrated, I may go crazy. It may be terrible, it may be useless. I just want to let you guys know that editing is, I think it's really important to edit your own work before you hand it to anybody. That's not just me saying that. Your work should be as perfect as you can get it, certainly before you try and show it to an agent or a publisher. Now, they are also probably going to edit it at that point because you need a second set of eyes on. But don't let that in 2021 keep you from doing your author edits or your self edits. It really needs to be as good as possible. And sometimes what I'll do, and I know a lot of authors do this, you'll put a placeholder. So maybe you'll be like, remember to come up with a name for this guy later, and you might even put that in text. I sometimes find myself typing out, wow, this is a really stupid thing for people to be doing in this situation, almost as a reminder to myself to go back and change that later. But so again, I don't know if this will be interesting or not. Maybe it'll just be an experiment that never goes anywhere. But let's go ahead and take a look at my editing process. Now, I am currently working. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen. And I think, okay. So you should now be seeing my Word document. Okay. So I am working on Clickers Never Die, which is the reboot of the famous Clickers series from J.F. Gonzalez and Mark Williams and Brian Keene. So I mean, I might feel stupid later if I did, but I don't think there's any big spoilers in this particular section. Certainly none that will make sense until you've read most of the rest of the manuscript, but I don't think taking a page or two out in the middle is going to really affect anybody. So let's start out here, and I'll just go through my process here. So it says, Boudin pushed aside a large fern, and the three men stopped in their tracks when they heard the sudden roar of exploding ordnance. Okay, so first of all, this is just a spelling or word usage error. In this case, we're talking about explosives. So that's actually spelled ordnance as opposed to an ordinance, which is like a small rule or law for a town. So here we have a spacing error. I'm not sure what caused this. I should point out that this section was actually written by my writing partner, Wiley Young, and I think he may have been having computer issues. I don't think this was an error that he made with the spacing here. So yeah, okay, if you can see that, I like to double space. Sorry for all you morons out there that like the single space. I know HTML, blah, blah, blah. This is not the argument for that. I like to double space, and frankly, when you're editing, you can go back and do a search for all the double spaces and convert them to single spaces really easily. But it's very hard to convert single spaces to double spaces, so I'll always kind of stand by that. Now, if you're wondering what I'm doing here exactly in the technical sense, I'm in track changes, and I'm using kind of an older version of Word, but I just haven't updated yet. All versions of Word have track changes. So what you're seeing here is the red parts are the changes. And if you're wondering why so here's a little change I just made while you were watching. If you're wondering why there's already some changes here, that's because going through this document so far, I've already come through and said, okay, well, search for spacing errors and search for certain little errors that we'll get to in a second. So that's why some of this stuff is already edited. So again, when you're editing, you can do it a paragraph at a time, you can jump around, you can do it a page at a time. I really jump around. And in this particular work, we have several viewpoint characters. So what I did when I was editing was I actually did all of the chapters from the first viewpoint character, then moved on to doing all the chapters from the second viewpoint character. And as you're going through, that will always, for me, trigger things where I'll be like, oh no, I changed what happened to Hermione in that one chapter, so now that's going to affect what happened in the Harry chapters going forward. So then you just have to go back and be like, oh yeah, I remember where I made this change. So going forward, it says, Jesus, sounds like they dropped the entire AAF's payload on Henderson, Boudin said. Okay, so I'm going to cut out the dialogue tag here. Okay, now I'm not one of these people that insists you need to cut out all dialogue tags. Of course you need them, especially if you have 3 or 4 people in any given chapter. You want to be clear who's talking. Now, ideally, if you were, Faulkner or Shakespeare or some kind of genius, you would just be so good at it. Would be so clear that people could just read a chapter and know who was speaking every time. But for the most part, most of us authors are not that good, and most readers are like, I don't feel like trying to figure out who this is every time. However, in this case, this piece of dialogue comes after a sentence where we just identified Boudin as the speaker. Okay, so he says, Jesus, sounds like they dropped the entire AAF's payload on Henderson. So what he's talking about here, this is set in World War II. He's talking about the Army Air Corps. Okay, so what I would actually do at this point is I would go ahead and Google that. Is AAF, I think he's saying Army Air Force, because they're talking about a bombing run from some airplanes. So at this point, I would step back. I'm not going to do it right now because in the middle of recording a video. I'm going to step back and check whether AAF is the correct abbreviation for that time period. With Google, it's amazing. You can just do it right away. Whether AAF was in use in that time period, and whether and then I would probably go back and search to see if we've ever mentioned AAF before. And if not, then this would be the place where I should explain that he's talking about the Army Air Corps. This was before they had the Air Force. All the planes were just part of the Army and the Navy. So I'm pretty confident that we have not mentioned them before. So after I get off with you guys, I'm going to go back and double check on that. But for now, I'm just going to spell it out, Army Air Corps, and going forward, see if we use it again. If we do use it again, we'll use AAC and so on and so forth. Next sentence, the jungle glowed. Oh, okay. So one thing I want to point out about this dialogue, normally I would say, me personally, I would say, Jesus, it sounds like they dropped the entire Army Air Corps payload on Henderson. Now, the reason I'm not going to do that, as I said, this is my writing partner's sentence and his character. And this character is a Cajun character from Louisiana. So his sentence formations and stuff are a little less formal. Dialogue in general is going to be less formal than prose, so you can feel okay with dealing with that. In this particular case, it's less formal, and I know he speaks less formally, so I'm going to leave that like that. And if you're wondering, do I really analyze every sentence and every word I type like this? Yes, I absolutely do. I'm not doing this. I didn't pick this chapter out for any particular reason. It was literally just where I left off. So you're getting the unadulterated. This is, for those of you who are fans of mine, this is the way I wrote Brain Eater Jones. This internal thought process that I'm outlining for you right now is how I wrote Jones. Okay. That'll make sense if you've read the book, because it's very stream of consciousness and that kind of thing. Okay, so he says the jungle glowed with distant fire. Fair enough. The planes dropped some bombs. The jungle's on fire. They were still a mile off from the airfield, but Doodles didn't have any intention of going further. So I might change that to they were still a mile off from the airfield, but Doodles didn't have any intention of going any further. But then we have that double any, so I'll actually probably take it out here. And I think that just sounds better in my ear. They were still a mile off from the airfield, but Doodles didn't have intent. No, that doesn't make sense, does it? All right, so we'll go and use the handy reject and reject that change because it's really not pertinent here. So sounds good. We'll leave that sentence the way it was. He decided to plead his case instead. Can't get there now. Why don't you two come with me? I know all the best hidey holes that the Tojos have abandoned. Okay, so what happened here, and again, I didn't pick out this chapter deliberately or anything. This does take place in World War II. I do know that this racial slur was very common at the time. However, I am attempting to publish this in 2021. I don't want to have a current, recent Asian slur that will cause people harm. I know that Tojo's, I guess you would consider it still a slur, but it is a time period appropriate slur that I think does not carry quite the same weight. So what I did was I went through the manuscript, as I said earlier, and I went ahead and changed every instance, although it would have been true, and this would have been the sort of thing that American service members at the time would have genuinely said. I have to do kind of a balancing act here and say, okay, I know what they really would have said. I don't want to whitewash the racism of the past and ignore it. So I want to be clear that they are racist. And we talk about some of that stuff. We talk about the propaganda posters and the depictions of the Japanese at the time as rats and monkeys and the kind of very ugly propaganda that existed at that time. So we do address some of those issues in the book to some extent or another. But I felt that this was, just straight up throwing these slurs out every couple chapters was not appropriate. So that is why I changed that. So he says, I know all the best hidey holes that the Tojos have abandoned. We can stay there, wait until the Turner shows back up with the Navy. Okay, so this seems like it was just either he might have been about to say until the Navy shows back up, or until Turner shows back up with the Navy. Now, I don't think we've mentioned Admiral Turner before. This is a historical character. So this sentence still makes sense if I just change this to, we can stay there, wait until Admiral Turner shows back up with the Navy. Other than that, I know all the best hidey holes. I will also check this on Google. I think hidey holes may be hyphenated. It is an unusual usage, so I'm not sure off the top of my head. Again, this is something that if I was not recording a video right now, I would Google right away and make that change. Doodle saw that the corporal was a religious man. Okay, now this is something that we've already breached. Okay, so this is one of those things that happens, and particularly when you're going back and forth between co-authors. We already established, so Doodles is the Navy guy. Boudin is one of the Marine Corps guys. And the guy that he's talking about is called Preach. He's a religious guy. We know that. They've called him Preach in front of Doodles. So this sentence essentially carries no weight right now. Okay. So what we can do is say something like, okay, so then we go on to say, he'd be able to teach Pinchy. Pinchy is the crab. Pinchy is the crab monster. The ways of the Lord, tame. I'm going to change that to tame his innate savagery. Oh, and this is part of the process too, is sometimes going forward and thinking about how you're going to make that initial change. I want to change this whole sentence somehow, but I'm going to read what the rest of the context that it stands in is, okay? He'd be able to teach Pinchy the ways of the Lord, tame his innate savagery, enough that he could take off the rubber bands, keeping his claws bound tight. His dreams of living out his days surrounded by people who understood the magnificence of Pinchy were interrupted by the sounds of footsteps and hushed voices. Okay, so we do know that Preach is religious, so we might say something like, Doodles was hoping to appeal to Preach's faith, let's say. He'd be able to teach Pinchy the ways of the Lord, tame his innate savagery, and now this comma doesn't need to be here. Tame his innate savagery enough that he could take off the rubber bands, keeping his claws bound tight. So I'm gonna delete tight because that's just excessive there. We know that his claws are bound. So I may be revealing more about the manuscript than I wanted to, but not really. I think it's probably going to be established early on in the marketing phase that one of these stories is about a boy and his clicker. So Doodles is a guy who has found a clicker, and because he was the ship's cook, knew enough to put rubber bands over the lobster-like monster's claws in order to tame him. And here he's kind of crazy. He's been on an island living with a clicker. So he thinks maybe he can convince this religious guy to convert the crab monster. His dreams of living out his days surrounded by people who understood the magnificence of Pinchy were interrupted by the sounds of footsteps and hushed voices. Okay, so somebody's coming. Cool. All right. Now here's another thing that we've been doing throughout. The character Preach, who we were just talking about, throughout the book, Preach is not his name. However, his name is Willard Kimball. What I like to do, particularly when I'm editing, so I'm actually glad that this came up. When you're doing third person close, the idea of third person close is it's written from third person, but the narrator is not omniscient. So he only has the knowledge that the viewpoint character has. So when you're referring to people in third person close, I like to keep that universal. So so think about like maybe your family doctor. You always call him or her Dr. Smith. But obviously when Dr. Smith goes home to his wife at night, she calls him John or whatever. Okay. So if we were doing something from my perspective, he's always going to be Dr. Smith. If it's from his wife's perspective, it's always going to be John. So what I wanted to do to make this simple from this chapter is from Doodles, the Castaway's perspective. So he's thinking of him as Preach. So instead of Willard or Kimball, we're going to call him Preach. That keeps it simple. That makes it clear who's talking. So I went and I did a change at some point, because at some point you can see here we changed his name from last name Willard to last name Kimball. So sometimes he will be called Kimball depending on the viewpoint character. But now that we're in this viewpoint, he's always going to be called Preach. So that's why I'm making these changes here. Okay. So Preach raised his rifle, but Doodles saw Boudin raise his hand and call into the trees lightning. Okay. There was silence before a gruff voice responded, rolling. Okay. So what they're doing here is they're doing a call a password, like they did in World War II, like we still do in the military. Well, like I did in the military when I was in 15 years ago. So he's saying the password, and the guy's responding with the counter password. Let's see, how much of this do we have? Oh yeah, we can probably do this whole section here. If it's not too boring. If it's too boring, you've probably already signed off, because nobody wants to watch a guy typing all day. All right, so Boudin and Preach both lowered their weapons as a large, bald man in a tattered uniform emerged from the brush, followed by 6 other men. So one of the things here, unless it's a really common word that you can't really get around, I don't like to duplicate words too much in any given sentence. So if I did something like I said, it was a green clothing and the tide was green, I'll change one of those to like aquamarine or something. So it just jumps out at me here that he said bald man and 6 other men. So just to give it a little more variety here, he's a Marine, so I'm going to say a bald Marine. And I did at some point have to check whether Marine is capitalized commonly in typing or in prose, and it was. So that's why I'm capitalizing Marine, followed by 6 other men. That sounds a little bit better. Doodles recognize the Marine uniforms. Oh, so I just mentioned that, so that's why I'm going to change that there. With the bald man being a sergeant. Okay. So this is just an error that Wiley made. He was not in the service. So there's just little picadillos, and I was not in the Marine Corps, so I hope I'm doing right by the Marine Corps characters in this book. I've been doing a lot of research to try, and it's tough because I can't even go with modern day Marine Corps stuff. I have to look up World War II Marine Corps stuff, of which there is not a lot of people with that experience that are living and that are on the internet. There aren't a lot of 80-year-old Marine Corps World War II vets chilling out on Facebook. So he said sergeant. Marines hate shit like this. He's actually a gunnery sergeant. So I'm going to change that. And although it's from Doodles, so this is kind of like a judgment call here. It's from the perspective of Doodles, who's a Navy guy. Would he know that this guy was a gunnery sergeant? I'm just gonna say yes, because Doodles is not he's a little bit crazy from being on the island, but he's not a complete idiot. He's dealt with Marines before. So since we changed this to Marine, I'm gonna make this sentence do some more work and say, Boudin and Preach both lowered their weapons as a large, bald Marine gunnery sergeant in a tattered uniform emerged from the brush, followed by 6 other men. And then we can delete this whole sentence. So now this sentence does all the work that both of those sentences were doing, okay? And here Preach says, glad you made it, Gunny. Glad you made it, Gunny, Preach said, stepping forward and shaking the larger man's hand. So this is another thing where I'm like, okay, Preach is a corporal. They were fighting together, but would he shake a dude's hand who was his superior? Like, it's not like impossible. Maybe they had a personal relationship, but I've been establishing Gunnery Sergeant Webb's character as very no nonsense, so I don't think he would do that. So maybe we can change this to stepping forward and sticking out his hand for okay, so we're in Doodles so this is the other thing. We didn't establish his name yet. Okay, so we can either establish his name earlier and make this sentence do a lot of work, so we can say a large, bald Marine gunnery sergeant named Webb in a tattered uniform emerged from the brush, followed by 6 other men. Okay, glad you made it, Gunny, Preach said, stepping forward and sticking out his hand for Webb to shake. Webb did not take it, but stared at it like it was a dead fish until Preach lowered it in embarrassment. It did not seem that fighting side by side together had earned the corporal the right to shake Webb's hand. Something like that. We'll go with that for now. Unfortunately, I may even go back and change that a little bit because now I've taken this one little thing here where he says he shook his hand. And I said, okay, let's expand this into a whole paragraph, okay, where we're establishing a little more about Webb. We're establishing a little bit more about their relationship. What I don't like about it is that Preach is a pretty confident guy, and maybe he is, maybe Webb is kind of unnecessarily dissing him, and maybe you don't diss a battle brother like that, but Preach is also wrong to try and shake a dude's hand who's a gunnery sergeant. So I may have to work on this a little bit. But you see how editing, this is actually a good example of how editing little things can expand into editing bigger things and, you know, establishing a lot more. So the man hooked a thumb back at the men following. Okay, so now we've established that it's Webb, so we can use his name. Webb hooked a thumb back at the men following him. Got guys from the second and third. That's all I've found. I'm gonna say second and third divisions. Oh, well, that's interesting. That showed up in the superscript there. So I'm gonna have to write it after the period and change that to a space and then add the period back here. All right. Webb hooked a thumb back at the men following him. Got guys from second and third divisions. No, he's right. He's right. We'll just leave that the second and the third. That's fine the way it is. We'll just reject all of that. That's all I've found from Henderson. Damn crawdads didn't stop. What's the situation down at the beach? Okay, so I'd like to break these up into two sentences. And I want to say that's all I've been able to find from Henderson. Those damn crawdads didn't stop. And this, I'm making these changes to Webb's character because his speech is a little bit more clipped, not quite as clipped as Boudin, who we talked about before, talks in kind of a Cajun rhythm. What's the situation down at the beach? Boudin gestured with his rifle at Doodle. How much we got? Okay, about a page left. So if you guys are enjoying this, there's just a little bit more. If you're hating it, well, if you're really hating it, then you probably already checked out. All right. The sergeant Gunny grunted and cast his eye at Doodles, who instinctively held Pinchy a little tighter as Gunny asked, "Who's the fish?" Okay. So we've already established that Gunny's a barely tolerated nickname for a gunnery sergeant, and we've already established his name back up here where he saw it on the dude's uniform. Which maybe we should say, maybe we should actually say Marine Gunnery Sergeant in a tattered uniform proclaiming his name to be Webb. Yeah, so, and you see, again, as I said, as you're going forward, that can cause you to rethink things you've already done. So, Webb, we can now replace all of this with, Webb grunted and cast his eye at Doodles, comma, just a comma usage. If I can't really necessarily explain everything about commas, and I probably don't even entirely do them right for like the English teacher style. But my thinking about commas is, yeah, I understand it has to do with clauses and stuff, but in commercial prose, I just look at commas. The easiest way is as where you would take a space in breathing while saying a sentence out loud. So this is part of why saying sentences out loud or reading manuscripts out loud helps as you are editing. So that's a very common trick, is to read every sentence out loud, and it helps you get a feel for the cadence and the timbre that you wouldn't just from reading it. So Webb grunted and cast his eyes at Doodles, who instinctively held Pinchy a little tighter as Webb asked, "Who's the fish?" And he's saying fish as in he's a Navy guy. Now, we have used the slang term squid before, so I think we'll say squid again, just although people could probably intuit what that meant. We've definitely used squid before to refer to Navy guys, so that's just going to make it a little easier on the reader, not make them go, wait, what? Why is he calling him a fish? Doodles gave his introduction, trying to keep the timeline of things straight in his head. His experiences on the Lexington felt like a lifetime ago. Okay, so you can see here where I changed it from one ship to another because the timelines didn't match. And when you're writing historical fiction, you're just going to find a ton of stuff that where you're just like, oh, I want to use this and it didn't happen yet. I want to use that and it happened 3 years before. So you just have to pick the best stuff you can. And I think people understand that there are going to be historical anachronisms because they make the story better rather than because you're wanting to make something historically anachronistic. But I ended up changing this from the, I forget what the real name of the Nasty Asty is, but they're both real ships that sank around that time frame. And the Lexington was just a better fit for Doodles. Boudin and Kimball, who you'll recall we already said in Doodles's viewpoint, we're calling Preach. Boudin and Preach occasionally would chime in with their own observations. So what I don't like about this is Doodles gave his introduction. Sounds strange to me, but I think what he was trying to say is Doodles introduced himself and briefly outlined where he came from, comma, trying to keep the timeline of things straight in his head. And this really should just be a different sentence. His experiences on the Lexington felt like a lifetime ago. Boudin and Preach occasionally would chime in with their own observations. Webb, again, we're now at the point where we're within Preach, or we're within Doodles's viewpoint, and he now thinks of this guy as Webb, which we've established across a couple of paragraphs. So from now on, he's going to be Webb unless something else comes up. So yeah, so like if they really bond later, maybe he'll start calling him, I actually forget Webb's first name, Alexander or whatever it is. Webb grunted when he was done. So you caught one of the damn things. And you know the Tojo positions. We already talked about that. I might want to say, and you know where Tojo is dug in, just because that sounds a little more like something that a gunner, a sergeant would say in this place. I don't know. There's nothing specific. There's no reason why there's nothing wrong per se with this sentence, except for the racial slur, which we already talked about. There's nothing so much wrong with this sentence. However, something about positions to me speaks to something an officer would say, and I think this is slightly more like what an enlisted guy would say. It's just a very subtle thing that probably nobody who reads the final product will even notice. Doodles nodded emphatically, gesturing towards the east. Okay, perfect. They have lots of little hidey holes. So now you remember, I think this is hyphenated, so we're gonna check that later. But the biggest is on that big hill south of the airfield. That's where Pinchy and I go to get the good stuff. And this is kind of a joke. I guess it kind of seems like we're making him out like he's a drug addict. And that's fine. He is not a drug addict. He's addled from being a castaway living on the island. And I get the joke that he was going for here, but I'm gonna change it to go to forage for the good stuff. So it doesn't. I hope that doesn't screw up the joke for the modern reader, which is that a modern reader is going to think of the good stuff as drugs. But for the time frame, saying that's where Pinchy and I go to forage for the good stuff, that makes it more clear what the character is actually saying. So there's also now you get into the whole meta thing, which I did a little bit with the racial slur stuff. You have to think about what a modern reader is looking for without betraying your characters as best you can. So then he goes on to clarify the joke. The good stuff was just a higher quality of rice. Now, I actually looked up what the Japanese rations were at that time frame, and they were rice and barley. They were little canisters of rice, barley, and either fish or some other kind of protein. So we have established that previously. So we know that they are canisters of rice and barley. So here I'm just going to add the rice and barley because we established that already. The good stuff was just a higher quality of rice and barley ration. In fact, we'll say ration canisters. But that didn't matter to a man who was on the verge of starvation. Again, we're going to use Webb in place of Gunny. Webb nodded and looked over at Boudin, and you all know it's coming. Preach. We'll take him with us, link up with Colonel Puller and the 7th. See if we can't find a way to get past those damn pillboxes and these fucking monsters. He then pointed at Doodles. Someone get that damn thing out of his hands and kill it so we can hand it over to the boys in intelligence. Oh, so this is actually a good cliffhanger to leave you readers with. This, maybe I just happened to stumble upon a good segment to edit after all, because now you know that Doodles and his best friend Pinchy the Clicker, or Lobster Monster, and a new Marine has showed up and wants to kill Doodles' best friend. So let's go through this paragraph real quick. We'll take him with us, link up with Colonel Puller, and this is a reference to Chesty Puller, the most famous, I think the most highly decorated Marine who ever lived, who I guess was just a colonel still during World War II. And the 7th, so I'll double check this. I assume that Wiley did all his research and he knew that Puller was at Guadalcanal and his unit was the 7th. But I'll double check that just to be sure. We'll take him with us, link up with Colonel Puller and the 7th. Let's say and see if we can't find a way to get past those damn pillboxes and these fucking monsters. So I've been trying to, we call them clickers. Some people call them clickers, but for the most part, all of the Marine characters are encountering these monsters for the first time. So I'm trying to get them all very gradually to where everyone is just calling them clickers by having a lot of them say clicking monsters. And that's just a very subtle thing. Like when you have to change these things, so like when I'm changing all the gunnies to Webb here, I'm establishing how Doodles thinks of this guy. And when we're referring to clickers, I don't think Doodles ever thinks of Pinchy as a clicker yet. I'll have to go and double check that. But I know that Gunny is not calling them by that nickname yet, Gunny Webb. So we're going to very gradually get him there by having him first call them clicking monsters, and then everybody's going to start just shortening that to clickers, and then hopefully in the next few chapters I won't have to keep being like, what are these things that nobody's ever seen before? Oh, okay, everybody knows what clickers are now. He then pointed at Doodles. Someone will get that damn thing out of his hands and kill it so we can hand it over to the boys in intelligence. I might capitalize that because he's talking about military intelligence. So that is probably capitalized. So there you have it. Let's stop sharing and hopefully go back to me here. So yeah, that was probably more than you guys ever wanted to know about my editing process. It was a little strange actually for me to say it all out loud, so I hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. This is actually something I've been wanting to do for a long time. I know that Jay Wilburn, who is a great author, great friend, actually, he will also appear in Clickers Never Die, or a namesake character. So you know, lots of information coming out about Clickers Never Die tonight. Well, I know that Wilburn does editing live like this, and I think he also writes live. That is the next thing I want to do. I really kind of have to prepare something for that, but hopefully you guys enjoyed this and it wasn't a complete waste of your time. Make sure to check out the other writers on across the board. We post every Monday and Thursday, and it is 8 different writers. So you're going to get different people once a month, every month. It's a great blog if you guys haven't been following it. And if you guys are fans of mine, I'm on there once a month. And otherwise, that's it. So thanks for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed it, everybody. We'll talk to you later.